My brother convinced my girlfriend to run away with him to another city and get married. He told her that he was better than me and I will never be as wealthy as he is. I was very broken and sad when I heard of it from my girlfriend's best friend. So I moved away silently. A few years later, we reunited at Dad's funeral, and when they saw my wife, their faces turned pale. See what happened? Hello. Thank you for your continuous support. This means a lot to us. If you enjoy the stories we share, kindly subscribe to this channel. It would be great if you can also comment on which city you are watching from. We might just give you a shout out in our next story. Today, our special shout out goes to Mark from Chicago. We are glad you enjoy our stories. Now let's dive into the details of today's story. I found out on a Thursday. It was raining, one of those stubborn spring drizzles that never quite turns into a storm but still ruins the entire day. I was on my lunch break, sitting in the parking lot outside a job I didn't want to talk about, eating a turkey sandwich that tasted like cardboard. That's when Mia, my girlfriend's best friend, called. Her voice trembled, and not from the weather. She said, "I didn't know if I should tell you, but you deserve to know." I remember thinking, that's never how good news starts. I already knew, somewhere deep down, that something had been unraveling. She didn't say it all at once. Mia spoke like someone peeling back a gauze dressing, slow and apologetic, trying not to cause more pain. "They left this morning," she said. "Your brother and Lila." The air in my car thinned until I could barely breathe. I stared at the windshield, where the wipers had smeared a line of water into a crooked scar. She told me they were gone, that he had convinced her to run away with him, to start over in another city. Miami. Of course it was Miami. He said I would never be as successful, that I would never be enough for her, and that he was better than me in every way. I didn't cry. That's the part that should have scared me more than anything. I didn't even curse. I just sat there while my sandwich went cold and her words echoed in my head like a low-frequency hum. My brother, the same brother who had held my head above water when we were kids, told off school bullies for me, taught me how to lie with confidence and smile while doing it. I should have known. He always got what he wanted, and he made sure the people around him felt like he was doing them a favor by taking it. That day, he wanted her, and he took her. When I got home, her things were already gone. The apartment felt hollow, like the breath had been knocked out of it. Her favorite scarf wasn't on the hook. The plant she kept forgetting to water wasn't on the windowsill. Even the toothbrush was gone. But the worst part? She left her key on the kitchen counter, neatly placed between the coffee maker and the napkin holder like a surgical instrument after an operation. No note, no explanation, just absence, as if I didn't even deserve closure, as if I'd been a placeholder until something shinier, louder, and richer came along. I didn't tell anyone, not our parents, not our mutual friends, not even my boss when I stopped showing up for 3 days straight. I let the silence stretch out, let it grow teeth and crawl into the corners of my life. People assumed I was just taking a break. They had no idea I was splitting apart in 1,000 quiet ways. I wanted to scream, but instead I started sleeping on the floor, eating less, talking even less than that. When I did speak, my voice sounded like it belonged to someone else, someone colder, sharper. It wasn't just the betrayal. It was who did it. Blood and love, torn out at the root. There's a special kind of violence in knowing someone who shares your DNA also shares the capacity to gut you. He had the same eyes as me, the same laugh, once. And Lila, she'd once said that loving me felt like coming home. But I guess home isn't enough when someone offers you a penthouse. He told her, he'll never be wealthy. Never be somebody. Not like me. I heard those words later, secondhand, but they burned just the same. They were his prophecy, his curse, and they were going to be wrong. That night, I packed a bag. Just the essentials, a few changes of clothes, my passport, the old watch my father gave me, and a single photo, one of me as a kid, standing beside my brother in matching red jackets. I didn't look angry in that photo, just small, unaware. I stared at it for a long time before slipping it into the side pocket of my duffel. Then I turned off the lights, locked the door behind me, and walked away from everything I thought was mine. I didn't leave a message. Let them wonder. I moved 3 cities over. Picked the place randomly off a bus map. I found a tiny studio apartment with water stains on the ceiling and a lock that stuck when it rained. Took a job I was overqualified for, working under someone 10 years younger with half the IQ and twice the ego. And every night, I came home, ate canned soup, and wrote in a notebook, not about them, but about what I wanted, who I needed to become to make their betrayal irrelevant. I didn't dream of revenge. Not yet. I dreamed of silence, of disappearing so thoroughly they'd think I had never existed. But even in that quiet, something was growing. A hardness. A new rhythm. I started waking up early, reading obsessively finance, strategy, psychology. I stopped looking at my phone. I never checked social media, never asked where they were or what they were doing. I wasn't building a life. I was forging an edge. I became the kind of person who speaks less and listens more, who watches, who waits. And I carried the sound of his voice. He'll never be like me. Like a nail under the skin, pressing in until it sharpened me. They say grief has 5 stages. I had one, ignition. The betrayal didn't break me. It freed me. From expectations. From needing to prove anything to anyone. From the version of myself that kept begging people to stay. In the rearview mirror of that bus, I saw the last flicker of my old life. And in its place, something colder smiled back. I didn't choose the city because it was promising. I chose it because no one would think to look for me there. It had no skyline, no ambition, just rows of tired apartment buildings with peeling paint and corner stores that sold expired toothpaste. The first morning I woke up in that studio apartment, the ceiling above me was the color of an old bruise. I remember staring at it for nearly an hour before getting up, as if I was waiting for the old version of me to crawl back into my chest. It never did. That man had gone with the key she left on the kitchen counter. My neighbors didn't ask questions, which was a mercy. The guy next door worked night shifts and slammed doors in his sleep. The woman downstairs screamed at her boyfriend every other Tuesday and cried at her sink the next morning. No one noticed I existed, and for the first time, I didn't mind. I was there to disappear until I was ready to be seen again. I got a job at a shipping warehouse unloading inventory, working the graveyard shift because it paid slightly more and kept me away from conversations I wasn't ready to have. The work was brutal, backbreaking, repetitive, but it did something to me. Burned off the softness I didn't realize I'd carried. My body changed before my mind did. Muscles formed out of spite. Hands hardened. I stopped flinching at loud noises or sudden voices. I became a shadow of a man, barely there but fully alive. My thoughts came in rows, organized like inventory racks. One shelf for pain, one for goals, and one I left empty for the version of me I hadn't met yet. I wasn't chasing closure. I didn't want an apology. What I wanted couldn't be given by them. I wanted evolution. And that required starting from nothing. The breakthrough came 6 months in. A coworker named Tarek, older, sharper than he let on, noticed how I read financial books on my breaks. "You're not meant for this place," he said one night, handing me a coffee. "Warehouse walls don't hold people like you. You got the eyes of a blueprint." That line stuck with me. He introduced me to someone who ran small business workshops at the local library. I went, not because I thought I could start anything yet, but because I was tired of hiding under fluorescent lights. I sat in the back, took notes, kept my head down. But the gears started moving. Over the next 2 years, I lived like a machine. Work, read, train, build. Every cent I saved went toward online courses, books, software. I taught myself code. I learned how markets moved, how people lied through branding, and how power wore a soft voice and expensive shoes. I learned not to react, not to show what I knew. Invisibility became leverage. People say revenge is best served cold, but that's wrong. The best revenge is served in silence, on a plate so expensive they choke before they realize who cooked it. I met her at a professional seminar hosted by a regional tech firm. I wasn't supposed to be there. Tarek slipped me an extra ticket. I showed up in the only suit I owned, the one I'd kept buried in a garment bag since the day she left. She stood near the back, arms crossed, watching the speaker like she was bored but too polite to leave. There was something arresting about her, composed, quiet, the kind of quiet that comes with influence. She was older than me, but not by much. She introduced herself after my question during the Q&A, said I had sharp instincts. I said I was just learning how to survive. We went for coffee that turned into lunch that turned into weekly strategy chats. Her name was Arya. She asked questions no one had ever asked me, not because she needed answers, but because she was testing for depth. She ran her own firm, fast-growing, ruthlessly efficient, entirely private. I didn't ask how she built it. She didn't ask what I was running from. That was our unspoken agreement. We met in the now, not the then. Over time, she gave me more than mentorship. She gave me space to become someone new. And I never told her about Lila, or my brother, or what they did. I wanted to be more than my origin wound. Arya offered me a junior position after I built a prototype financial tool she couldn't stop using. I turned it down. I said I wanted to earn my seat, not be handed it. She smiled at that. 6 months later, I was managing an entire vertical. A year after that, we were sharing a condo overlooking the water. She never once asked about my family, but I think she knew something. Sometimes she'd look at me like she recognized the ruin behind the ambition. We married quietly, no big announcements. She kept her name, by choice. Said it was more powerful than any man's. I didn't argue. The night we got married, I sat alone on the balcony while she slept. I had the old voicemail still saved, the one my brother left before he ran off with her. I listened to it once more. His voice, arrogant and smug, saying, "You'll never be what I am. But don't take it hard. Some people just peak low." I almost laughed. I deleted it. Just like that. And in its place, I felt something I hadn't in years. Not vengeance. Not even pride. Just distance. Like that part of my life had finally been scorched clean. I didn't plan to see them again. I thought that part of the story was done. But stories don't end when we're ready. They end when they finish their loop. And the loop began to tighten the moment my father died. The call came on a gray morning. Heart failure. Sudden. My hands didn't shake when I hung up. I just walked to the window, looked out at the sky, and said nothing. I told Arya I'd be going back for the funeral. She didn't ask if I wanted her there. She simply said, "I'll come after the meeting. Don't wait for me." I didn't wait. But when she walked into the funeral home, hours later, dressed in black, face unreadable, they saw her. And everything changed. They say time heals. It doesn't. Time just gives you room to evolve around the wound until the person who bled isn't the one walking anymore. And the man who showed up at that funeral, he wasn't the boy who got left behind in a half-empty apartment with a key and no goodbye. That version of me had died quietly, like a broken battery losing charge in a drawer no one opens. The one who walked into that room, wearing a black suit tailored to hide the scars, didn't come to grieve. He came to measure distance between who I'd been and who they still thought I was. My father looked smaller in the casket than I remembered. He'd never been a large man, but something about death shrinks people beyond their bones. I stood beside him while a string of forgettable condolences passed through the air like static, nodding politely, saying little. My brother arrived late. Of course, always the entrance, always the spectacle. He had that same fake humility in his shoulders, like he was doing the room a favor by existing in it. And trailing 2 steps behind him, like a shadow of her former self, was Lila. Her eyes caught mine for half a second. That was enough. She looked older, but not in the way time ages us, in the way regret corrodes us. She had once carried her beauty like a promise. Now, it looked more like a memory. She didn't speak. Neither did I. We exchanged nothing. No words. No gestures. Just a quiet acknowledgement that whatever story we'd written together had long since burned, and all that remained were ashes no one dared to touch. But him. My brother, he smiled. Smug, condescending, like I was still the one he left behind, the one he pitied, the one he assumed would never matter in the end. And then Arya walked in. It was quiet when she did. She didn't command the room with volume. She did it with silence. That kind of silence that rearranges the air, that makes people stop mid-sentence without knowing why. She walked straight to me, nodded once, and stood beside me like she'd been there all along. I didn't look at my brother. I didn't have to. I could feel the air change in his lungs, the sharp intake, the stuttering silence. He knew her. Of course he did. She was his CEO, the woman he'd only ever seen behind a glass wall in meetings he was barely allowed into. And now she was my wife. His face lost color slowly, like the blood was trying to retreat. Lila touched his arm, whispered something, but he didn't respond. His mouth opened slightly, like he might say something, but then closed again. Arya didn't even glance at them. She leaned in and said softly, "It's colder in here than I expected." I just nodded. That was all we needed. They'd already lost, and they didn't even know how much yet. After the burial, I watched from a distance as they tried to make sense of what they'd seen. I could feel Lila's eyes darting between us, her mind scrambling to reconcile who I'd become with the man she left behind. It didn't add up. I wasn't supposed to succeed. I was supposed to fade, to grow bitter, to live out my life in the long, gray shadow of my brother's ambition. But I hadn't just changed. I'd become someone unrecognizable. And I had done it without spite. That's what made it so unbearable for them. They weren't the reason I became who I was. They were just the reason I stopped waiting. That night, Arya and I stayed in a hotel overlooking the city. She had work calls to take. I sat by the window, sipping tea I didn't really want, watching the skyline blink like a slow heartbeat. My phone buzzed, an email from her assistant. Subject, asset list, terminate access. Attached was a document I knew would gut them. Company-provided car, housing subsidy, expense accounts, all revoked by morning. No explanation given. No appeal process. Just gone. All of it. Because Arya didn't tolerate conflict of interest liabilities, especially not when those liabilities happened to be her employee's brother, the same one she'd quietly flagged for internal review 6 months prior. I didn't gloat. I didn't even smile. It felt surgical, clean, like a bone being set back into place after years of misalignment. I hadn't orchestrated it. I hadn't needed to. The universe has a way of balancing stories when you give it enough silence and enough time. Arya didn't know the full history. Not the betrayal, not the apartment, not the voicemail, but she knew enough. And that was all she needed to know. Power doesn't need justification. It just needs precision. The next morning, I got up early. Went for a walk. Same black coat I'd worn at the funeral. Same shoes that didn't quite match the gravel path. I walked until the city started to breathe, until the skyline turned gold with morning light. And I thought about how strange it was, how life wraps its hands around your throat, and then years later, you realize it was only teaching you how to breathe differently. Slower, deeper, quieter. I wasn't angry anymore. That was the dangerous part. The rage had served its purpose. What remained was clarity. And with clarity came decisions. By noon, he'd lost access to everything. Arya sent me a text, just a period. That was our code. It meant, it's done. I imagined them waking up in that company-paid apartment. The locks changed, their company emails dead, their security badges blinking red instead of green. I imagined my brother checking his phone, expecting an apology email or an HR loophole, and finding nothing but silence. I imagined Lila packing in a rush, angry and confused, not realizing the collapse had started years ago, the moment they chose each other over decency. I didn't tell anyone, didn't post, didn't brag. Power doesn't announce itself. It arrives, invisible and irreversible, like sunrise, like justice. And this wasn't the end of their fall. This was only the wind before the plunge. The audit team had already been notified. My brother had made mistakes, small ones, at first, the kind that could be buried in quarterly noise. But eventually, even noise begins to sound like a pattern. And patterns are fatal in companies like Arias, especially when your CEO sleeps beside the man you betrayed. Grief wears different faces. Some cry loud and collapse into arms. Others go still, silent, so tight-lipped you'd swear they weren't feeling anything at all. I didn't cry at the funeral. Not when the priest said my father was a man deeply respected. Not when my brother faked a eulogy he probably Googled that morning. And definitely not when I watched my mother's hand shake as she lowered the rosary onto the casket. Grief for me had come and gone years ago, burned out in a different kind of death, the day I stopped being his brother and started being something else. We didn't speak during the service. Not a word. My brother sat across the aisle, his jaw twitching every time I looked in his direction. Lila sat beside him, her posture so straight it almost looked unnatural, like she was bracing for something. I didn't need to wonder what. Arya hadn't arrived yet, and they were already unraveling beneath their clothes. The moment she stepped into that chapel, everything would tilt. They just didn't know how far they'd fall. Not yet. She arrived 45 minutes into the service. No one saw her come in at first. She moved quietly, deliberately, like a shadow in silk. Her black dress wasn't dramatic, but it was clean-cut and precise. Everything about her was. She sat beside me like it was a boardroom meeting. No perfume, no jewelry, just presence. And it was deafening. My brother turned around by instinct, maybe because he felt the air tighten. And when he saw her, really saw her, his face didn't just pale. It emptied. The same expression a man wears when he realizes the car speeding toward him isn't slowing down. He blinked, once, twice, and then whispered something to Lila. Her head turned slowly, and the moment her eyes landed on Arya, she froze. I watched it happen, like someone watching a tide go out and realizing the water isn't coming back. My wife didn't look at them. She didn't need to. Her indifference was the blade. She crossed one leg over the other, glanced at the altar, and whispered, "He hated lilies." I nodded. "He hated a lot of things," I replied. We said nothing else. Not to them. Not to anyone. After the service, there was the usual shuffle, the people who act like they knew the man, the ones who just wanted to be seen at the funeral of someone with a reputation. My brother walked up slowly, dragging Lila behind him like an anchor. "I didn't know you were coming," he said. "I was not quite meeting mine." "I wasn't sure I would," I answered, then gestured slightly toward Arya. She thought I should say goodbye properly. His mouth twitched at the mention of her. This is your wife?" he asked, already knowing the answer. I nodded once. "Arya, this is Nathan," I said, purposefully skipping the word brother. Arya extended her hand. Calm, unreadable. "Nice to finally meet you," she said, as if discussing a quarterly report. Nathan stared at her hand like it might detonate. "You're—" he started, but couldn't finish. Arya tilted her head, waiting. "Your CEO?" she said. "Yes. I know." The way she said it, icy, clinical, made it clear she'd known far more about him than he'd ever realized. The subtext was louder than the room. Lila tried to recover. "It's been a long time," she said to me, her voice smaller than I remembered. I didn't look at her. Not long enough. We walked away first. Left them standing there, awkward and incomplete. Arya didn't say anything until we were back at the car. "He tried to flirt with me once," she said as she buckled in. "Didn't even know who I was. Just saw a woman in a power suit and thought she'd be impressed by a man who owned nothing but debt." I laughed once, short and sharp. He always did overestimate himself. She turned the key, the engine purred to life, and we drove off without looking back. The past was behind us. But not for long. By the next morning, the asset recall had been completed. Keys disabled. Access codes wiped. Emails purged. HR delivered the news with neutral language, budget cuts, organizational restructuring. "Thank you for your service." But anyone who understood power would know what had really happened. It wasn't just that he was fired. It was that his existence in that world was revoked. Deleted. Like he'd never been allowed to stand there in the first place. I didn't call to gloat. I didn't even text. I let silence be the signature at the bottom of the letter. Later that week, Arya forwarded me a file. A quiet audit had begun 6 months earlier. Not by her, but by her CFO, a cautious woman who flagged unusual spending patterns in mid-level management. The file included travel reimbursements that didn't add up, phantom expenses, and a forged signature. My brother's. He wasn't just arrogant. He was sloppy. Fraud had a way of surfacing eventually, especially in a company where precision wasn't optional, it was the bloodstream. I didn't have to accelerate the fire. He lit it himself. All I had to do was walk through it when the time came. That evening, I sat on our balcony while Arya worked late in her home office. I stared out at the city and thought about inevitability. How betrayal always comes full circle. How silence isn't weakness, it's strategy. I had spent years disappearing, rebuilding, rising. And they had spent those same years sinking under the weight of their own lies, too blind to see it happening. The look on his face when he saw her, that was the moment the power balance shifted. Not when he lost the job. Not when the locks changed. But when he realized the man he tried to bury had returned wearing the one thing he could never fake. Peace. Some reckonings don't arrive in fury. They arrive in whispers, contracts, and quiet signatures that end entire lives without raising a voice. I didn't plan it that way, but when it started to unfold, I understood the beauty of restraint. It wasn't about revenge anymore. It hadn't been for a long time. What happened next wasn't personal. It was structural. It was the moment someone touches a wall that looks solid, only to find it's been hollowed out beneath their feet. And when they fall, no one's there to catch them, because they burned every bridge on the way up. The Monday after the funeral, Arya called a meeting. Not unusual, except this one included legal. I wasn't in the room. I didn't need to be. My brother sat across from the company's internal audit team, arms crossed, face drawn. He didn't realize he was being cross-examined, not briefed. The tone was clinical, cold. They presented figures, timestamps, misaligned budgets. Then they placed a printed reimbursement form in front of him. A signature, not his own, not forged against him by him. And then a second, a pattern. When he tried to defend himself, Arya entered the room. She didn't sit. She didn't need to. She stood beside legal, hands clasped in front of her, and said just one line. "We're cooperating fully with the state board." That was it. No threats. No raised voice. Just a final sentence that landed with the weight of a sentence in the criminal sense. His face dropped. That's when he knew. Not just that he'd been caught, but that it was her. That she was the one who moved the final piece. And he didn't even have my name in his mouth. That's the part one cherished the most. He never saw me coming. I waited for him to call. He didn't. I waited for Lila to show up at my door, tears ready, another round of revisionist history prepared. She didn't. What I got instead was a voicemail, 37 seconds of silence before his voice cracked through. "You don't have to do this," he said, like it was all a misunderstanding. "We're family." That word. Family. As if he hadn't redefined it the day he laid next to someone who had whispered my name in her sleep. I listened to that message once, then deleted it. The past didn't get a call back. That night, Arya and I sat at the kitchen counter eating dinner like it was any other Monday. She didn't bring it up. Neither did I. But there was a hum between us, like an electrical current. She handed me a glass of wine, leaned in slightly, and said, "You're quieter than usual." I shrugged. He always thought he was untouchable. Arya tilted her head. "Men like him don't realize they're drowning until they see your shoes at the edge of the pool." I laughed, low and tired. "He thinks I pushed him in." She held my gaze and said, "Let him." Within 72 hours, the investigation moved outside the company. Our compliance officer escalated it. The fraud was minor on paper, but the implications weren't. Misuse of company funds, falsification of financial documents, embezzlement under state code. Lila tried to clean it up behind the scenes, called an old friend at the district office. But by then, it was too late. Arya's name on the documentation meant it was officially above everyone's head. There were rules. And the moment the state took interest, there were no more favors. Just facts. My brother had made enemies of numbers, and numbers never lie. Lila did show up once, eventually, at the edge of a parking garage, of all places. I was heading back to the car after a lunch meeting when I saw her waiting beside the concrete railing, arms crossed, sunglasses on. She looked like someone waiting for a train that wasn't coming. "I didn't know," she said as I approached. "Didn't know what?" I asked, not stopping. "About her. About the job. About everything." Her voice cracked slightly. I turned just enough to face her. "You knew the kind of man he was," I said. "You chose him anyway." She flinched. "You think I didn't regret it?" she asked. I paused, then said quietly, "Regret is a mirror. It doesn't undo the reflection." She didn't follow me after that, and I didn't look back. A week later, the charges were filed. I didn't attend the hearing. Arya did, sitting in the back row of the courtroom like she was reviewing a presentation. No emotion, no spectacle, just a quiet witness to consequence. My brother stood in front of the judge with a public defender and sweat on his collar. No assets to liquidate. No network left to protect him. No sister-in-law willing to speak on his behalf. Lila was gone by then. Packed up. Disappeared. Some say she went back to her mother's house in another state. I never asked. When the gavel dropped, it didn't sound like victory. It sounded like closure. A soft thud that echoed through years of silence. Arya came home that night, dropped her purse on the counter, and poured herself a drink. "It's done," she said, like we'd just closed a business deal. And maybe we had. I didn't respond. I just took her hand in mine and held it until the quiet felt full again. I never needed revenge. That's the truth. I didn't crave their pain. I didn't fantasize about their fall. What I needed was distance. What I needed was for my reflection to stop carrying their fingerprints. And now, finally, I could see myself without them attached. No shadows. No shame. Just me clean, scarred, and whole. They had tried to unmake me. But in the end, they only introduced me to the man I was always meant to become. The first thing to go was the house. It was a rental, technically, one of those executive properties offered as part of his compensation package. But once the contract was voided, so was the roof over their heads. The locks were changed within 48 hours. I didn't know that part until weeks later, but the image lingered. My brother returning home with Lila in the passenger seat, arms full of groceries or maybe just clinging to denial, only to find a keypad flashing red and a note on the door. Access revoked. 2 words. A sentence that doesn't scream, but doesn't have to. After that, it was the car. His badge had been deactivated. No entry to the garage. Company assets repossessed before he even had time to call in a favor. I imagined him standing on the sidewalk beside his wife, watching a tow truck pull away with the last symbol of the life he thought he built. They'd assumed the worst had already passed, that the funeral, the firing, the exposure had been the crescendo. But grief has an aftershock, and consequences have patience. What they felt now wasn't rage or confusion. It was the cold awareness that no one was coming to rescue them. Not this time. It was only when the criminal charges became public that the silence turned hostile. Friends stopped returning texts. Old allies from the firm suddenly couldn't be reached. Lila's social accounts went dark. My brother, once a man who measured his worth by proximity to wealth, was now adrift, untethered from the system he'd used like scaffolding. And still, not once did he reach out to apologize. Not to me. Not to anyone. That part never changed. Even stripped of everything, he clung to arrogance like a life raft. Like dignity could be faked if you just refused to admit you were drowning. I didn't take joy in it. That's what people don't understand. Justice isn't joy. It's relief. It's a loosening in the chest. A stillness that arrives when a cycle finally breaks. I watched the storm from afar, never speaking his name, never clarifying the rumors. My silence was my weapon, and by then, it was also my peace. Arya and I didn't talk about it much. She was busy expanding the firm, and I was navigating my own growth, new projects, new partnerships. The world kept moving. And that, more than anything, is what broke them. Time didn't stop for their failure. It sped up. The symbolic things started piling up. I heard from someone that Lila sold her engagement ring for cash. It barely covered 2 months of rent in a studio far smaller than the place we'd once shared. She applied to a few startups, but word travels. No one wants a liability tangled up in a high-profile embezzlement scandal. I imagined her walking into interviews, sitting down across from hiring managers who recognized her name from whispers, not resumes. And I wondered if she ever thought about the night she left me, about the key she placed on the counter, about how sure she'd been that I wouldn't matter in the end. There's a difference between being forgotten and being remembered for the wrong reasons. That's what they were facing now. They had once rewritten the script of my life, cast me as the man left behind, the one too small for ambition, too soft for survival. But now their own story was being revised, line by line, by the same reality they once weaponized. She'd once said my ambition made her feel like she was waiting for something that never arrived. I used to replay that line in my head, wondering if she was right. But now I understood. She wasn't waiting on me. She was avoiding herself. When I passed by the courthouse one afternoon for an unrelated meeting, I caught a glimpse of him through the glass. Not up close. Just far enough to see the posture of someone who no longer knew how to stand straight. He was thinner, older, hair messy. The suit hung wrong, like it belonged to another man. I stood across the street for a long time watching him. He never looked up, never noticed. And I felt nothing. No thrill, no anger. Just the ghost of something that used to ache, and now didn't even flinch. He had become someone I used to know. Nothing more. Back at home that night, I found an old notebook in the back of my closet. One from the warehouse years, pages filled with scattered thoughts, goals, quotes I scribbled during breaks. On the last page, there was a sentence I'd underlined twice. You don't have to scream to be heard. I didn't remember writing it, but it was true. My whole life had become the embodiment of that line. They had screamed. lied, postured. And in the end, it was silence that brought everything down. Silence and time. And the kind of focus that doesn't ask for attention, it just builds until it becomes undeniable. Arya came home later than usual, dropped a folder on the kitchen island, and kissed me without saying a word. I opened the folder. It was a property deed. Hillside, quiet, secluded. We can build something permanent now, she said. Something no one else has touched. I looked at her, this woman who had seen my ruins and never asked for the tour, who never once tried to fix me, only cleared space for me to rise. I nodded slowly, not because I needed the house, but because I understood what it symbolized. We weren't running from anything anymore. We were building forward, and so were they, just in a different direction. My brother in court-mandated programs, wearing a suit to hearings he didn't believe in. Lila in a city where no one knew her name, avoiding mirrors that still remembered. They hadn't just lost a lifestyle. They'd lost the version of themselves they couldn't live without. The part that believed they were untouchable. And once that illusion shatters, you don't just lose status, you lose story, identity, meaning. And that is the kind of collapse no one prepares for. It didn't happen all at once. The unraveling, the final layer. It came slow, like dusk creeping over a quiet road. So soft you don't realize it's night until everything's dark. I had spent years building something untouchable. Not just success, not just distance, but silence. A silence so absolute that they'd never think to ask what I actually knew or when I knew it. They assumed I vanished after the betrayal, when in truth, I had stayed just close enough to see the fall begin long before they noticed the ground weakening beneath them. And Arya, she knew, long before I ever said a word. The truth is, I didn't meet her by accident. That networking event, where she found me, where she complimented my instincts and offered guidance, was no coincidence. I'd known who she was before she ever knew my name. Back when I was still working night shifts, still eating from tin cans and chasing sleep like it owed me something, I came across an industry article. Arya Delane, tech strategist, financial tactician, CEO of one of the fastest growing firms in the state. And listed beneath her, my brother's name, buried 3 lines deep as a mid-tier data analyst. When I saw it, something clicked. Not anger, not revenge. Just alignment. I watched from the sidelines for months. Learned the structure of her company. Attended events I knew she'd be at. Not as a stalker. As a strategist. I didn't charm her. I didn't lie. I just showed up prepared. Asked the right questions. Listened more than I spoke. And slowly, she took notice. She thought she found me. But the truth is, I presented myself like an opportunity. Not because I wanted to hurt my brother, but because I needed to become someone who wouldn't need to. I didn't seduce her with ambition. I gave her space to see what she wanted and what she didn't. She was smarter than I expected. Sharper. And that's where everything changed. Because somewhere along the line, it stopped being a move on a chessboard and became something real. Arya wasn't part of the plan. She was the pivot. The reason I stopped needing the plan. And I never told her the truth. Not because I was ashamed, but because I wanted to know if love could still exist without the fire of revenge burning underneath it. Turns out, it could. She didn't know what my brother had done to me. She just knew I was chasing something, and that it came from a place too quiet to be harmless. But that changed, too. The night after the charges were finalized, Arya poured herself a drink, stood at the window of our new place, and said, without turning around, "I knew who he was the moment I saw you." I stood still, unsure if she meant it in passing or as confession. She continued, voice low, steady. "Your brother introduced himself to me 2 years before we met. Called me just the HR girl in heels. Thought he was charming. I thought he was noise." She turned then, met my eyes. "When I met you, I recognized the silence. And I let it speak. I didn't know what to say. So I said nothing. Just stood there, watching her like she might vanish." "You knew who he was, and you hired him anyway?" I asked eventually. She nodded once. "I wanted to see who he was when no one owed him anything. And I wanted to see what you'd become when no one believed in you but yourself." Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. The room tightened around her words. "You never told me," she added, softer now. "Why not?" I stared out at the same skyline she had been watching. Because I didn't want to rewrite the past. I just wanted to outlive it. We stood like that for a long time. And in that silence, a truth settled that I hadn't allowed myself to feel until now. I hadn't just rebuilt my life. I'd rewritten my origin. And the final piece of that rewrite wasn't revenge. It was recognition. My brother had spent his whole life believing he was the center of every orbit. That gravity answered to him. He never realized someone like me, someone silent, someone discarded, could become the axis instead. And by the time he did, his fall wasn't about punishment. It was about inevitability. The next morning, I visited the house where I grew up. It was empty now, for sale, stripped of furniture, of ghosts, of everything except dust and a strange echo of childhood. I walked the hallway slowly, fingers brushing the faded wall where we used to measure our heights in pen. Mine stopped 3 inches shorter than his. I always noticed, always pretended not to care. I stood in my old bedroom, smaller than I remembered, and pulled a photo from my coat pocket. The same one I'd taken when I first left. 2 boys in matching red jackets, smiling like they didn't know how much pain they'd cause each other. I folded it once, twice, and slipped it into the drawer of the old desk. Let it stay there. Let it rot in wood and memory. You don't get to rewrite the past, but you can decide what part of it you still carry. And I was done carrying ghosts who never apologized. On the way out, I passed a mirror in the hallway, cracked on one side. I stared at my reflection, searching for the boy who once stood in that same spot with his brother's words rattling in his chest. He'll never be what I am. But I couldn't find him anymore. All I saw was a man who had outlasted the insult. A man who didn't need to destroy the past to make peace with it. The graveyard was quiet, the way only places full of dead things can be. Not just people, dreams, memories, versions of ourselves that no longer fit. I didn't come with flowers. I didn't believe in performances anymore. I came with something smaller. Something I'd carried longer than I should have. An old flip phone, dead battery, cracked screen. The same one I'd used back when they left. When I thought silence was weakness, I held it like a relic. Because inside that phone was the last echo of the man I used to be, and the voice of the brother who broke him. The voicemail wasn't long, 39 seconds, but it held everything. His laugh, his certainty. She deserves better. You'll never be what I am. I used to play it like a bruise I couldn't stop pressing. Now, I hadn't heard it in years. Didn't need to. I knew every syllable. I knelt by the grave, not his, but our father's, and set the phone down on the soil. Not because he deserved to carry it, but because something did. Something that wouldn't try to crawl back out. I didn't cry. Just whispered, "You can keep this." Then covered it with dirt. One palmful, then another. It didn't feel like revenge. It felt like ritual. Like placing a hand over a wound and saying, "This won't bleed anymore." I stood there a little longer than I meant to. Let the wind pass through me. Let the silence settle. Behind me, the trees moved like old hands waving goodbye. I thought of how many versions of me had died before this moment. The one who begged. The one who doubted. The one who stayed quiet because he thought losing someone meant losing himself. Each of them had carried the same weight. And now, for the first time, I could feel it lifting. I left the graveyard without looking back. Some stories don't need a final line. They just need a page turned. Aria was waiting in the car, sunglasses on, fingers drumming the steering wheel like a metronome. She didn't ask if I was okay. She didn't need to. She just reached out, placed her hand on mine, and squeezed once. That was enough. Love, I'd learned, isn't in the grand gestures. It's in the quiet knowing. In the space someone makes for your silence without asking to be let inside it. We drove in silence for a while, the city rolling past like a memory on mute. Later that night, we stood in the living room of the new house. No furniture yet, just echo and dust and promise. Aria opened a bottle of wine, handed me a glass, and leaned against the frame of the kitchen doorway. "So," she said, "what now?" I looked around at the bare walls, the open windows, the way the light spilled in without resistance. "Now," I said, "we fill the space with things no one else has touched." She raised her glass. "To that," she said, and we drank, not to the past, not to the pain, but to the vacancy it left behind. The clean slate. I spent the next few weeks in quiet motion. Boxes, calls, walkthroughs, work, nothing dramatic. Just life, rebuilding itself without needing to prove anything. My brother's name disappeared from the news. No appeals. No redemption arc. Just absence. Like a dropped signal. Lila, from what I'd heard, was working part-time in a bookstore near the coast. Some said she looked tired. Others said she looked relieved. Maybe both. People like her, they never expect consequences to last. They count on time to blur betrayal into mistake. But time doesn't blur what you bury with clarity. It crystallizes it, preserves it, and keeps it from infecting the future. One morning, while unpacking, I came across the red jacket from the photo. Still folded, still faded. I held it for a long time. It didn't fit me anymore, physically or otherwise. I almost tossed it. But instead, I boxed it up. Not to keep, not to wear, just to store in the attic of memory where things belong once they've done their damage. That jacket was a symbol, not of him, of who I was before the unraveling, and it no longer hurt to see it. That's how I knew I was free. Arya and I built the rest of the home slow. No rush, no noise. Each piece we brought in had meaning. The rug she picked out in Lisbon. The lamp I found in a secondhand shop, chipped but still working. We didn't talk about the past. Not because it hurt, but because it no longer required explanation. What happened had shaped us, yes, but it didn't own us. And in that quiet understanding, we found something stronger than justice. We found peace. A few weeks after the move, I stood in the backyard alone at dusk. Just the sound of crickets, wind, and the distant hum of something cooking on the neighbor's grill. And for the first time in a long time, I felt still. I wasn't waiting. I wasn't running. I wasn't climbing some invisible ladder to prove I mattered. I was here, present, not because I got even, but because I got away. There's a difference. One leaves you empty. The other leaves you whole. As the sky turned from gold to gray, I said it out loud. Not to anyone. Not to the air. Just to myself. I survived. And then, softer, more certain, I rebuilt. 2 statements. No punctuation. No drama. Just truth. I thought back to that voicemail. That old insult. You'll never be what I am. He was right. I wasn't. I became something else entirely. And that's the part he never understood. Revenge isn't becoming them. It's becoming someone they could never be. If this story gripped you, don't scroll yet. Hit subscribe for more slow burn stories of betrayal, transformation, and silent justice. Every day, we bring you one story like this, crafted to make you feel everything. Don't miss it. See you soon in the next one.